This is a video with Dr. John Opfell discussing Nobel Prize winners that he has known during his lengthy career.
I have not known any Nobel Prize winners as personal friends. I have had several as acquaintances. They would recognize my face, my name. The first one of this group would be Professor Richard Feynman of Caltech. I met Feynman after I just finished my final orals. I decided that I need to do something for which I could see no use at all, that I could unwind. I chose learning the Japanese language. I went to the opening class with Mr. Ito at Pasadena City College. Preceding me through the door were Mr. and Mrs. Feynman. I knew him by appearance. I was pleased to meet her. We went through the first lecture, and then afterwards I told them it was a pleasure to meet them and so forth. Several days later, I met Professor Feynman on the campus, and I asked him, "Why were you interested in learning Japanese?" Well, he says, "I have to maintain an image." He says, "Recently I was at a meeting of physicists in Tokyo, Japan, and we were on a sightseeing bus and traveling about. And the bus stopped, and it was quite a long stop, and people got nervous and excited and talking. So finally he said, I just stood up, and I went up to the driver, and I said, Arimatsu Shinahara Gozaimasu. And he said, then the bus started. And so all my colleagues were of the opinion that I spoke Japanese. The only word in all that gibberish I gave that was Japanese was gozaimatsu. All Japanese statements end with gozaimasu. It means sort of a thank you for listening. And so he was learning it for that. He did not stay with the entire course. He came for several lessons. But he always greeted me on the campus. And then some while later, my friend Tad and Vera Machowski had a Polish party at their home in Altadena. They live about 4 or 5 doors down from Mr. and Mrs. Feynman. So at any rate, when they had the party, a lot of people came, and the Feynmans particularly enjoyed Polish parties. But Richard Feynman didn't find a lot of people there that could understand what he was talking about. He found that my ear was receptive, and so he looked for it, he found it, and then he filled it with lots of opinions and things. Very helpful, very interesting. It's an interesting relationship, and I met with him several times at the Machowski's house. But then I bought Richard Feynman's lectures in physics, and I've enjoyed reading those. I feel myself very fortunate to have known Professor Feynman as much as I have, although it's very little. It enriched my life a lot.
What about Linus Pauling? What about Linus Pauling?
When I was a student at Caltech, Linus Pauling was the chairman of the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Engineering. And so when graduating for my master's degree, he signed my diploma. Then later, when I came back to Caltech for my doctor's degree in 1951, shortly thereafter, Linus Pauling won his second Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize. And he invited to his home for a reception, a garden reception, the graduate students and faculty from the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Engineering. And so Olga and I both went, and we had a wonderful evening is the guest of Professor and Mrs. Pauling. Now, I have taken the Pauling therapy now for, 20, 30 years. I believe in it. I think it makes me much healthier. I take the minimum dose, which is 4 grams a day of vitamin C. I take 2 grams a day of L-lysine with it. Linus Pauling lived to be 94 years old. He had a keen mind clear up to the end. Okay, that's... interestingly enough, Linus Pauling appears in a picture of the great physicist at the meeting in Copenhagen back in the 20s when Pauling was a graduate student. He had the initiative to go all the way there and to invite himself to be part of the team. So there he met all the great physicists. Sommerfeld was the host, and then of course there was the great British and Danish and German physicists. So Pauling was an extraordinarily brilliant and bright man that make enormous contributions to.
Did you ever work with him or assist? Did you ever work with him or assist him in anything?
No, I never worked with Linus Pauling. I just was grateful that he was chairman of my department. He's the one that passed on what I learned at Caltech. He had a major role.
So he would know you.
Huh?
He would know you.
Yeah, he affected me, though I may not have affected him.
No, but he would know who you are.
Yeah, well, of course I knew who he was.
No, but would he know who you were?
I think he did.
Okay.
Pauling knew about everything.
Tell me about your early days in the computer development.
When I was at Stanford University, I had 2 important experiences. One was that I took a course in statistics with Professor Georg Polya, who was an immigrant from Hungary. And at that particular time, he was considered the world's preeminent mathematician. After they finished the statistics course, I asked him, could I have a little private tutoring on advanced concepts in physics? And he says, of course. And so he gave me a textbook that I should read and work all the examples in which I did. And I was the only person in the course, and it was a very good, close relationship with this very great man. Now, at the same time, I was taking a course in economics from Professor Theodore J. Krebs. And I became very fascinated with economics. And so I bought a book called The Mathematical Foundations of Economics by Paul Samuelson. Now, Paul Samuelson, as I recall, was the father of Larry Summers. There was some relationship between Larry Summers, advisor to President Obama, and Paul Samuelson. And Paul Samuelson was one of the preeminent economists of his day. His book was very important to me. Now, the important part of my career is the last half of the book was devoted to the mathematical theory of the quadratic form. Well, the quadratic form is the essential mathematical element in statistics. I had a very readable, interesting, understandable description of the core of statistics. And so when I went to Caltech, back from my doctorate, they had various things I could do, and one of them they wanted me to do was to do a least squares fit of their engineering data to mathematical relationships. That's what the quadratic form does. So I was able to take the previous work that was done with the earliest IBM 360 computer, and I was able to manipulate the mathematics so that I could increase the speed of the calculations like tenfold. It was really quite dramatic. And so I was sort of strawman at the Caltech computer laboratory. It was one large room with windows on all sides, which were always open because the computer was huge and gave off a lot of energy.
What year was this?
What?
What year was
This
this?
was 1951, 52. Now, the reason Caltech had the computer was because of Linus Pauling. Linus Pauling first got the IBM tabulator in to help with the calculation of what's called a Patterson diagram, which is used to determine the structure of proteins, which Watson and Crick then found the structure because they used Pauling's methods but worked faster. Pauling didn't know he was being challenged. But anyhow, I had a number of Pauling students come there for training in how to use the computer. A number of these became Nobel Prize winners. Alex Rich, I think, particularly comes to mind, but there were several others. Anyhow, I became very proficient in the management and use of the computer, and I did a lot of work. For example, I did all the correlation and forecast of the data of nitric oxide, which is the data I produced is still the standard reference of that material. But I published a book on the behavior of hydrocarbons, which was based on these calculations. So I had several students that I trained, both in chemical engineering as well as chemistry, and some in electricity and radio and so forth, and how to use the computer to make forecasts and handle mathematical problems. After I got my degree, I went to Cutter Laboratories, and there I had only minimal contact with the computer. They used it only for accounting purposes. But my statistics and design of experiments also were very important. The first task I was given was to get acquainted with Dr. Howard Fieldsteel, who was the assistant to Dr. Sabin, who developed the oral polio vaccine. Dr. Fieldsteel proceeded to teach me virology, and I taught him about the statistics and evaluation of data and design of experiments. And so it was a very rich experience. Only a little bit was I needed to use a powerful computer. After I left Cutter Laboratories, I went to Dynamic Systems. Let's see, was it Dynamic System? It was Dynamic something or other. Anyway, in Pasadena, and I was one of the top scientific managers there. I was in most of my work was concerned with the sterilization of spacecraft and the technology and so forth that stemmed out of my role at Cutter Laboratories as Director of Process Engineering. But part of my job was to supervise work done with the computer. Now, we had a young man who was very proficient with the computer, and he would find jobs where they needed to do analysis. Now, for example, one of them was collecting the data on the bacterial contamination of the waters in Santa Monica Bay. And so that was one of the jobs that we did. But at any rate, after that, I went to work with Ford Aeronutronic in Newport Beach. My neighbor and my son's close friend, Andre White, was director of the higher-powered Philco computer we had there. I learned to use the computer through a remote terminal while I was there, so I was able to do tabulated data and that sort of thing. And then after I left Philco Ford, I went to not aerodronic, what do we call it?
Well, didn't you do some work?
The name of the company it became Allied Signal. It was Garrett Corporation in Torrance, California.
No, but didn't you do some work
Right.
on? Didn't you do some early work on the space program?
And but before I let's finish this up. At Garrett Corporation, then I had access to non-stop high-powered computing, and we did all kinds of computing, among other things. I was a engineer that was at the top level of troubleshooting. So a new problem came along. If it wasn't obvious who could solve it, then I had it to work with. And I used whatever tools I found useful: statistics, design of experiments, tabulated data, whatever. But at any rate, before I went to Allied Signal, Garrett and Allied Signal Corporation, I was there at Aerotronic, Philco Corporation in Newport Beach. My main activity there had to do with the space program. And we were concerned with the design and development and deployment of a Mars lander. Now, the Mars lander for those days had to be sterile.
What year was this?
This was in the 1960s. The most important contribution I made, I think, to that whole program was not that I had new ways of sterilizing things, but I brought to their attention that the Soviet Union had already landed a spacecraft on the moon, and that we needed to know, did they sterilize it or not? Because of the millions of dollars spent to make ours sterile, we needed to know whether the problem was real. And so that kind of fell on affairs. But at any rate, a friend of mine that I met at Cutter Laboratories decided that I was possibly the preeminent authority on the sterilization of spacecraft, and that I should give a lecture on this at the Committee on Space Research at Warsaw. And so at Warsaw, I spoke about this sterilization.
This was during the middle of the Cold. And this was during the middle of the Cold War.
Yes, middle of the Cold War.
So you went to Warsaw.
And we'll come back to that. I went to 5 different Committee on Space Research conferences during the time that I was with Philco Ford. These conferences were in Mar del Plata, Argentina, in London, England, Vienna, Austria, Prague, Czechoslovakia, and the first one was at Warsaw, Poland. Now, is that enough about the computer?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, after that, on the trip to Warsaw, I had stopped in Brussels and Leuven, Belgium, to visit one of my Caltech classmates who had become a professor at Leuven University. And when came time for me to leave Belgium to go to Warsaw, I got on a Belgian Sabena plane, and I sat in the aisle seat in the first row. And sitting next to me was a lovely lady, and by the window was a gentleman. And I noticed after the plane took off, the gentleman was reading an interesting book that on one side it was English and the other side it was Russian. So I asked him if I could copy down the name of the publisher and author. So he passed the book over, and then I handed it back. And I asked him why it was that he was studying this on the plane. He said, my name is Hippolyte Coles, and I'm the ambassador of Belgium to the Soviet Union. And this is my wife, Gladys Coles. And I got off in Warsaw. They went on to Moscow. But Gladys says, when you get to Moscow, you must look us up. And so on my way home, I came by way of Moscow, Leningrad, and Stockholm, and these places. And
this is during the Cold War, and this is during the 1960s.
Yes.
Okay.
And so when I got to Moscow, I said, I don't know the Coles. They're important. Why should I take much of their time? So the morning I was going to leave, I called, and Mrs. Coles answered the phone, and I said, well, I'll be leaving in the late afternoon, but I wanted to call you and thank you for your courtesy. She said, oh, we have to go to a reception at the American Embassy, and the car will call you for you in 15 minutes. So the car came, and we went to the American Embassy, and I came in there, the ambassador first, and then Mrs. Coles, and then there's me. And we met the reception line. The first person we met was the United States Ambassador Foy Kohler. And then we met various other people. Then we had 5 Soviet Union generals. Then we had the repartee and the repasts and all that. And it was a wonderful experience. And then they got me back to the airplane so that I could go on to Leningrad. And I got to Leningrad about 10 at night. I had a hotel room, but I didn't go to sleep. It was one of the late nights that everybody was up all night long. And so the next morning I left for Finland. Oh, let's see, that's...
The Test Ban Treaty.
Why do I treasure the remembrance of Gladys Coles?
The Test Ban Treaty.
Ambassador Coles met his wife when he was the Belgian consul to Kerala in India. And Mrs. Coles, Gladys, is of a Kerala extract. But she has that charming way that people from India have.